Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the Architecture League's Program Director. I'd like to welcome you to this month's FF Distance Edition. This program reinvents the League's in-person, studio-based First Friday receptions, tours, and project reviews with virtual visits to design offices across North America. We hope that these programs provide a similar opportunity to gain a first-hand sense of the studio culture, to see where and how firms are working, in addition to seeing, when possible, and virtually touring recent projects or work in progress. This year's series is focused on architecture practices who expand disciplinary boundaries by taking on multiple roles, including design advocacy, fabrication studies, research, and community engagement. You can find videos of recent programs on the League's website. And next month, Mexico City-based Rosana Montiel Estudio de Arquitectura will be the final studio visit of this program season. Today's program features the work of LA Mas, a nonprofit based in Northeast LA that designs and builds initiatives that promote neighborhood resilience with the stated mission of envisioning a Northeast Los Angeles where communities of color have equitable access to the power and resources needed to shape their futures. LA Mas's founder and co-executive director, Elizabeth Timmy, along with design lead Chaz Kern, will lead the presentation. Although today they will be focusing on the firm's Backyard Homes program, where they are designing and building Section 8 housing properties in the form of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, it is important to note that LA Mas has a broad and seemingly ever-growing scope of activities that in many respects makes it better defined as a social service agency that is structured by architecture and design, but with a mission more expansive than bricks and mortar projects. Elizabeth Timmy has been named a Woman of the Year by Los Angeles magazines. She's been one of Curb's Young Guns of the Year, and as a member of the Next City's Vanguard in 2019, she was a recipient of the Vanguard Big Idea Challenge. She is currently an adjunct teacher at Cal Poly Pomona and has taught at Woodbury and Harvard universities. She also writes for journals and publications, including Manifest Journal, Log, and Tabula Plena. Chaz Kern is project manager of the Backyard Homes Project, a one-step shop ADU program that enables the average homeowner to become a provider of affordable housing. She has been recognized in Culture Magazine's inaugural Young Architects list and is an organizer with Design as Protest, an anti-racist, non-hierarchical, action-based collective of BIPOC designers dedicated to design justice in the built environment. The program will be moderated by Christopher Hawthorne, who is Chief Design Officer for the City of Los Angeles, a new position created by Mayor Eric Garcetti in 2018. Prior to joining City Hall, he was architecture critic for the Los Angeles Times for over a decade. Christopher is also an adjunct professor of the practice of English at USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, where he directs the Third Los Angeles Project, a series of public conversations about architecture, urban planning, mobility, and demographic change in Southern California. Following the presentation and Krister's discussion with Elizabeth and Chaz, the discussion will be open to all attendees, at which point we hope you'll turn your cameras back on. Please keep them off and your microphones off during the presentation, and put your screen on speaker view now and switch it back to gallery view afterwards. You can pose your questions in the chat section, and when possible, and if you feel comfortable doing so, we invite you to ask them in person when called on. You can do the raise your hand function or just raise your hand since your camera will be on. And then finally, information will be posted in the chat section for those seeking CEUs after the program. So welcome, and welcome Elizabeth and Chaz.
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chaz Kern, Program Manager of the Backyard Homes Project and Design Lead for LA Mas. Our work and office is located in Northeast LA, the traditional land of the Tongva people.
I'm Elizabeth Timmy, founder and co-executive director, as Anne mentioned in her lovely introduction, and co-executive director of LA Mas. Thank you to everyone for spending your afternoon or evening for wherever you're coming from. We would like to thank the Architecture League and Anne for extending this invitation to highlight our work, and for Christopher Hawthorne for agreeing to facilitate this conversation shortly after reimagining the permitting process in LA, also on the heels of a book launch and right before announcing the winners of a very successful local design competition that he organized, which drew international interest. Christopher, you have a lot on your plate, and we're very honored for you to be with us tonight.
And tonight we are going to be talking specifically about our housing work and the collaborative process that we are establishing in our office to define our programs, projects, and our impact. So we're a group of urban planners, designers, architects, policy wonks, and community advocates. Our team members are majority Latina and Asian identifying. And as a group, we collaborate on programs that support residents of Northeast LA facing food and housing insecurity. And we've worked mostly virtually over the last year. So I'm a first generation Filipino American designer that believes that the built environment should reflect the priorities and identities of the communities living in them. And growing up with an immigrant parent, I saw the resourcefulness and thoughtfulness, the approach that my mom took to reimagine things and objects and spaces around her to meet the needs of me and my family. So over the years, our conventional American suburban front lawn became an extension of our home, and was periodically transformed into a vibrant gathering space that resembled the social spaces she was comforted by growing up in the Philippines. And I came to LA Moss about 4 years ago, and I saw that centering community voices in the work was not negotiable. And advocacy and engagement are really foundational for people's ability to shape their own neighborhood through design.
Like Chaz, my background is also in architecture. I am an only child and a third generation architect. After losing both of my parents in my early 20s, I felt welcomed by and a deep affinity for communities of color in Los Angeles. It was here that local cultural practices around heritage and healing were the gifts that grounded me and led me to spend the rest of my career committed to social justice, using design as a tool to engage and as a value that imparts identity, joy, and ownership. I founded LA Moss because I believe in the potential of design to be a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to public projects and civic planning that can support and voice the resilience and articulate the needs of a community. We began as an urban design nonprofit that used architecture and policy to help communities shape the future of their growth through pilot projects like alternative forms of affordable housing, public realm installations, and facade makeovers with small business support. However, in the last year, during the pandemic, we pivoted to being a place-based organization and recently updated our mission last summer to reflect our commitment to centering working class communities of color in our work in Northeast Los Angeles.
And today, we're partnering with NELA Residents, Northeast LA, to design initiatives that elevate community agency through empowerment and ownership. Our ongoing programs include a weekly food distribution program, our Backyard Homes program, and our Backyard Homes program, where we work with homeowners to build affordable ADUs that increase Section 8 housing stock. And we have been thoughtfully working to evolve our housing program in ways that center working class residents and promote community ownership in Northeast LA. And we're currently having conversations with neighbors about their housing priorities, inviting their knowledge, culture, and leadership to meaningfully drive our work. And our approach focuses on honoring local knowledge while bringing together the power of informal and formal systems. We focus on issues like food and housing insecurity because they are intrinsically tied or connected to the compounding racial injustices that have oppressed and immobilized working class communities of color.
To give a bit more context on how we've approached our work in working class communities of color in Los Angeles, it's no secret to most of you probably that as a city, Los Angeles has struggled to provide an adequate amount of housing for all of our residents. Our homeless count as of last year was 64,000, and many of us expect for this number to drastically increase during the pandemic. Housing in Los Angeles is very unaffordable, namely for communities of color, for a number of reasons.
Here, as in most American cities, low density single family zoning has historically been used as a tool to segregate in disenfranchised Black communities and communities of color. So today, over half of the lands that could be developed into residential use is zoned for single family homes. So instead of challenging the structure of inequality or inequity, there has been an active effort to invest in and preserve the existing low density housing stock for the few that have the privilege to owning a single family house over the expense of the many who are living in housing unstable conditions.
Also, it's a little known fact that LA is the most densely populated city in the US. We have a lot of Angelenos who do not have access to formal systems of affordable housing and live as a multifamily in single family homes and apartments. So essentially, what this means is that the majority of Angelenos are living in urban conditions in a suburban footprint. Suburban communities like Pacoima and Panoramic City, which were founded 50, 60 years ago to meet the needs of white flight from city centers, are now home to thriving Latinx communities of service industry workers.
And today, over half of all the land that could be developed into residential in the city of Los Angeles is zoned for single family use. In 2017, when over 100,000 people were at risk of experiencing homelessness in LA County, state policy changed to allow for accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, which allowed homeowners to add dwelling units to their single family zone lots.
With this abundance of single family lots in the city, we saw that there was a possibility for backyard homes or ADUs to be an alternative to traditional affordable housing methods. And in 2018, we began to focus our efforts on developing the Backyard Homes Project, where we were building ADUs or are building ADUs or backyard homes that are future Section 8 housing stock. Our goal was to explore how the average homeowners could become providers of affordable housing and make sure the 500,000 single family lots in LA were part of the solution.
So to shape our program, we conducted a year of research, talked to over 100 homeowners and housing experts to understand what it would take for ADUs to be a form of affordable housing. And so Section 8 came up as a flexible mechanism that could bridge the gap between income that a homeowner needed to justify building a backyard home and the amount of housing unstable renters that could afford to pay. The big idea was that to ensure that housing units is rented affordably, all participating homeowners committed to serving as a Section 8 landlord for 5 years, meaning they would rent their new ADU unit at a market rate to qualified low-income tenants.
We partnered with half a dozen nonprofits, which was no easy feat, including 2 community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, and the local LA Housing Authority, to figure out how a homeowner could finance, permit, and design and build an ADU and rent it affordably for at least 5 years.
And we had over 200 homeowners apply to the program and 5 final ADUs in the pipeline. So 2 are in bidding, 1 is in permitting, and 2 are currently in construction. And each homeowner also has a choice on the architectural style that can either reflect the context of the community or their personal cultural context. Inspired by the Sears catalog and other prefab flat-packed home deliveries from the turn of the century, they gave homeowners a variety of flavors and interior and exterior style options to choose from, regardless of their unit type.
As we enter the construction phase, which is the last phase of this program, we are conducting a full construction site around a pre-existing structure, which is totally bananas, using a driveway as a common access point for machinery and crews, while tying together infrastructure like electricity and sewage that was not installed with the intention around growth and flexibility. Each of these projects have been challenging for a variety of reasons, but one of which being that in the eyes of the city, every backyard home is a standalone, completely new development project, each one with a one-off permitting process. Every homeowner has their own specific set of desires, which we're navigating through that construction process, not to mention physically building these homes during a pandemic in a highly collaborative, hands-on stage of our program during a time of social distancing. navigating problem solving, coming up with collaborative construction solutions, trying to explain things that in normal situations are misunderstood through masks.
So something we realized or have realized in hindsight is that in order to navigate all the complexities inherent in each project, we need a fully developed team triaging each site meeting weekly through the pre-construction and construction process. And we are walking homeowners through the variables that could come up on site with their project, tapping into existing infrastructure. We are also explaining to the homeowner zoning overlays, historic preservation zones, and the city's permitting processes, clearances, almost simultaneously when we are walking them through these variables as a team. And we also have to build the homeowner's capacity to be developers in order to ask a homeowner to take out a loan against their home, to rent their future unit at a price fixed by the government as part of the Section 8 process, and let a construction crew into their backyard. We set out to change the nature of how affordable housing was funded, occupied, implemented, and depicted. We wanted to build a program that could establish that ADUs could be part of the important menu of options in affordable housing, and it didn't have to look affordable. It could represent the diversity and spirit of inclusion that is needed for all of us to pitch in response to the housing crisis. However, the amount that we are investing in each one of these one-off projects has limited our ability to have a larger impact. Although we streamlined the design process through our vernacular inspired approach. Each project is a new permitting process with a new contractor, which requires us to learn and problem solve under new conditions.
And so it was extra serendipitous when we were invited to participate in a pilot program by the mayor's office and the city of Los Angeles to pre-approve plans for ADUs. We took the opportunity to partner with Mighty Buildings, a home builder that 3D prints prefabricated homes. For us, we got a chance to embed the learning process from our Backyard Homes project into a new construction method to expedite the development process, while also including vernacular elements like trim and siding into the 3D printing method without adding costs. So here is our Spanish Modern model redesigned with 3D printed prefabricated wall sections to be assembled on site by a local contractor.
In many ways, this was the perfect evolution of our project because we were given the opportunity to streamline the permitting process. We knew from our experience vetting over 200 homeowners from our Backyard Homes project that no two sites are alike, and that cutting some of the red tape required to permit an ADU could translate into making our homes more affordable for local residents. However, we found that although we have continuously refined our program with the help of complementary initiatives like this, we could not build these homes at a price point that would be affordable enough for homeowners that have been traditionally disenfranchised from wealth building to participate in this newest model of legal home owner development. So ultimately, we have found that without free money, subsidies, or forgivable loans, no ADU program we could have created was capable of engaging low to moderate income homeowners without undermining their financial stability.
In the past year, we've been thinking a lot about who our program was benefiting and who this housing program was benefiting, and what the impact has been of this housing program, which we're wrapping up. And this is a central core conversation we're having in the office parallel to our Backyard Homes work. In creating the program, we made a misstep by investing in the capitalist-oriented assumption that building the capacity of an individual, of a person in privilege, would result in a benefit to an individual experiencing life and housing instability due to structural inequalities. Also, in our efforts to innovate on so many different criteria with our Backyard Homes project, we were not capable of intentionally prioritizing different efforts within the program. We were building the capacity of our partners, government agencies, individuals in positions of power, but not the working class communities of color. So we were just too spread too thin to be intentional about this larger impact of the program, which ultimately has been to date that we're building up a homeowner who already has this privilege of owning a home to the benefit of a Section 8 or a housing unstable resident, and the impact was trickle down. So in the past few months, we have come to the conclusion that our program's inability to have this larger impact is due to a misalignment between our programs and our operations. We were not structured, which you can see on the left, to practice our values and our mission. We have not been structured to be an anti-racist organization. And so you see this slide represents our current shift to reorganize and to make sure that our approach or working model is anti-racist and is in line with our new mission.
As an exercise in unpacking the impact of our programs, the office placed our projects along the spectrum of engagement. The spectrum was developed by Rosa Gonzalez of Facilitating Power. So the spectrum charts a pathway to strengthen and transform our local democracies, as it's summarized. So if you have a project and a certain set of community engagement goals, how much power does a community have in the project? And what is the impact of your actions? So first on the spectrum is ignore on the left, where you have no community engagement on a project and you're denying access to the decision-making process. The spectrum builds to community ownership, or deferred to ensure communities have direct say over what is needed to shape their own futures. For context, many architectural projects that have community engagement fall into the consult category, where teams are gathering info from the community to inform the design project, but there's no accountability that the community priorities would be included in the final project or product. So why get to ownership? We can all agree that centering the most marginalized voices is needed for a more equitable world. We have witnessed the transformative solutions thrive when they're harnessed through a system of collective power. However, within a system of white supremacy, marginalized people's ability to sustain cultural infrastructure will continue to be assaulted. And so the most sustainable place for transformative solutions to be conceived of and brought to scale is within the community ownership model.
When we went through this exercise of placing our projects along the spectrum, it became clear that although we believed in and were committed to our vision for residents to have the ability to shape their own neighborhoods, we were not developing our programs with that outcome defined from the outset. We were not practicing our mission because as an organizational model, our approach was not rooted in this notion of community ownership. So in other words, you can't do what you aren't being. And this exercise revealed that if we don't put in place internal organizational strategies and external project goals to get to this aim of ownership, we have no ability to fully realize the potential of our efforts and to meet the impact of the mission that we've set forward. So it was at this juncture, it became clear that we needed incredibly different and new tools and new methods, new methodologies for developing our work. On the bottom left, you see the beginnings of us developing something we will be calling our theory of change, which we also called our secret sauce, but we'll be getting into that more in a bit. Setting up all this intentionality, and we want to be explicit about this, was necessary to allow us to increase the impact of these alternative models for community-based growth. It was necessary to prioritize building models of collective power, and it was necessary to avoid reverting to systems of capitalism that favor individual-based investments.
So our mission statement defines our reason for being and often reflects really big aspirations, true for all nonprofits. And an intended impact and a theory of change clarify what impact a nonprofit will hold itself accountable for and how it will be achieved. We went through this exercise of developing both the intended impact and the theory of change as a group over the course of maybe 2 or 3 months. So on the left is our intended impact. It specifies who our population focuses, where our organization will do its work, and what specific outcomes we want to achieve. On the right is the theory of change. It explains how our organization will achieve that impact and the approaches we will undertake and the actors or other actors we will work with alongside. So the mission statement for LA Moss, the new one that we've developed over the summer after many drafts, is on the left. And the highlighted portions are corresponding to the colors on the right of the intended impact. So it can help kind of give reference to where we're kind of pulling from. So the who in our population, a focus is working class communities of color. Where is Northeast LA? And what, which is the specific outcome we want to achieve, overlaps the who and the where. And so this is community engagement, which we're defining as meaningful relationships or meaningful engagement to build those deep relationships. Community engagement in this context is defined as an ongoing formal and informal relationship building. So it's like the air we breathe. It sustains and directs the work. Inside the what is the theory of change, which will be explained in the next slide. The gray bubble that holds all of this is the secret sauce. So the secret sauce is the organizational approach or capabilities that make our work uniquely impactful. Right now, it's specified as a why, as upending racism and community development. So if we want to have a justice-oriented community development approach, then we have to take active approach to shifting the racist current systems that are barriers to this. The TOC, or theory of change, is a reflection of how we will achieve the impact. So in our approach, any program or project should be identified by working class communities of color in NELA. In essential activities, the project should build community empowerment, knowledge building, community leadership, organizing, that's the little bubbles on the left, and or it should build community ownership, what we're considering or defining right now as wealth building, program ownership, community governance. The smaller circles are named knowledge building, wealth building, etc., are considered linkages in the theory of change. So it's how an approach will connect to a greater impact. And the identified project should also be linked to an area of focus of housing or economics. So these are the components of the impact or the ultimate goal, ultimate social goal, which is the community-led development or community who are leading their own development. So as we work through implementing the theory of change, we're testing it within our programs like the Mercadito, testing and reiterating as we go through each kind of step. The Mercadito is an ongoing weekly food distribution program. It was developed upon existing resources we were offered. It was not an explicit community identified need. And the Mercadito has been running for a few months now. We received feedback from our staff, the resident volunteers who have been running the program, and food hub leaders, folks who run kind of local distribution sites through our program to understand how the program could be evolved from what it is right now. And we developed a quadrant diagram with the ownership spectrum on the x-axis to evaluate community impact, and with the question, is this a community identified priority on the y-axis? So the interactive diagram has helped us evaluate the potential next steps and all the ideas that we've been hearing or putting out in the Mercadito program through the lens of community priority and community agency. So there's so many different directions in which we could take the program. With this graph, we've been able to help unpack what we should do now, what we should do later, and what we should probably never do.
So with the world on fire, over the last year, we tasked ourselves with rewriting our mission and vision and values and collectively defining community ownership and empowerment, developing a theory of change, intended impact, defining our shared values, restructuring our entire organization and staff model, and are continuously unpacking what sort of work we do if it's not design centered. So building something new meant letting go of familiar things. We're letting go of a lot, but we have not been taking care of our well-being or acknowledging how the loss is affecting us in the exercise of decentering ourselves in the work. And a large part of our own capacity and resilience to do this work is from the work that we're actually doing in the communities we've built and connected to outside of the office. Community engagement and organizing work is exhausting. As we are undertaking this work to redefine everything, being in community with value-aligned folks has been enormously important to informing our emerging strategies in the office. We return to the notion that although community can be an ephemeral construct, community building is not. It is a tangible and real practice that continues to shape and give depth to our work and thinking.
So I joined Designers Protest last summer at the national call after George Floyd was murdered by a white police officer in Minneapolis. DAP, or Designers Protest, is an anti-racist, non-hierarchical, action-based collective of BIPOC designers dedicated to design justice in the built environment. I found a thoughtful, sincere, and undeniably impressive community of landscape architects, graphic designers, planners, architects, and community organizers, all dedicated to dismantling the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as tools of oppression. And as a lot of the work that I've done at LA Moss since summer, implementing a collective decision-making model, visualizing pathways to community leadership, and a lot more wouldn't have been possible without joining DAP and being in this community. So DAP exists to hold our profession accountable in reversing the violence and injustice that architecture, design, and urban planning practices have inflicted upon Black people and communities of color. We're working on onboarding new members into the collective, so please sign up and join us. For me, DAP feels like being home. Work around justice is really exhausting and it's lifelong, and it takes a collective who you can also experience healing and joy with.
So in the fall of 2020, Chaz and I also taught a studio with the cheesy name of Much ADU About Nothing, and the mindset with teaching architecture by centering the lived experiences of our people of color students, that is aligned in critically addressing the housing crisis and integrally linking to creating more equitable and progressive future for our cities. With every whiteboarding session in each problem or assignment, we reiterated the value of context not discussed and previous experiences not included in college architecture parlance, the precedents works of architecture. So we made it really explicit that there were values that are present in these students' lived experiences that weren't a part of studio culture and teaching, and we made space for that. Initially, students were asked to adapt precedents of early to late single family housing to accommodate various models and densities of co-living and multiple dwelling units, borrowing from past successful images and representations of suburbia to rebrand their rebooted projects. Each student worked to create compelling propaganda that presents viscerally appealing imagery for cohabitation, intergenerational living, and mid-density. Students unpacked the loaded symbology of the single family home, the capitalist nature of high modernism, and the exclusive voice of postmodernists building self-referential projects for exclusively white clients. The goal was not to have a perfect final project presented to a jury, but rather a project that was indicative of a deeper conversation where we unpacked and adapted the single family home housing typology led by a student body that was people of color and previously uninvited to share their personal history, culture, and perspective.
Elizabeth and I also had the opportunity to collaborate outside of the office with some team members on the submission for the low-rise competition held by the mayor's office, conceived and led by none other than Christopher Hawthorne. And our group submission, Adaptive Multi-Generational Housing, outlines a proposal to design new affordable housing to better meet the needs of multi-generational households in Northeast LA. We used the prompt of this competition to dig deeper into what our housing approach would be in a place-based context, explore various community ownership models, and although we couldn't embed real ownership into this project, we did center the lived experiences of our working class communities of color as a driver in this project, folks who are our neighbors and also our own experiences as team members. We engaged in new ways of working together collaboratively outside of the field of expertise, but instead in teams where we practice listening, collective authorship, all while trying to have some fun. And we also gained an inkling into what it would look like to collaborate in a new structure that wasn't beholden to a shared organizational model, which we knew we had to evolve or change. The key takeaway from working in these sessions was that we wanted to focus on what it would look like for communities of color to live where they worked. We also wanted to promote intergenerational permanence through housing that is adaptive and responsive with interchangeably live work environments.
Early in our design, Charette, a member of our group, made this community snapshot, which was in many ways a visual thesis to our project and something to which we measured our architectural intervention proposal against. This cartoon visually narrates a day in the life of a community member of Northeast LA, while demographics frame the impossible conditions to which communities of color are improbably thriving. The cartoon illustrates this family's ability to demonstrate methods of resilience and power shown in her and her family's entrepreneurial efforts. Rather than move away from this network of support and strength, the hero of this cartoon effortlessly comes up with a vision for the future of her family home that matches their vibrant and rich life. This partie was to create an adaptive housing strategy riffing off the traditional Spanish courtyard housing project situated across two shared single family lot sites. Our program supports a flexible and episodic timeline of use, which are staples of intergenerational dwelling models. We organized the project around 6 residential homes with live, work, room, accessory units with multiple outdoor gathering spaces that are supportive and ancillary to the function of new homes.
The overall design reflects the lived experiences of families at risk of having to leave their home communities, with most of new housing prioritizing 1-bedroom units over family-sized units. Along with the steep housing prices in Los Angeles, it is increasingly unaffordable for working class renters and newer generations to rent or purchase separate homes. Additionally, new boutique housing projects, often equated to live work with the creative class, are kind of in some ways overlooking the realities of working class communities of color, where this model, live work of enterprise, has been highly regulated and overpoliced.
Movable partitions in each home are placed next to built-in day beds within bedrooms, living rooms, and kitchens to allow for flexible sleeping nooks for short and medium stay guests and family members within these rooms. For instance, our 4-bedroom home has dedicated sleeping space for 12 people. Each workroom within the homes can be used by the family or rented for commercial use. Additionally, we proposed policy changes that would allow commercial activity in all our zones.
The flexibility for families to grow into and adapt their homes mean that those who have lived in and shaped their neighborhoods for generations can continue to do so for years to come. It shifts the narrative from individual homeownership as a sole strategy for wealth building to a strategy which has historically been inaccessible to communities of color due to housing discrimination and a growing racial wealth gap. And instead, it focuses on the ability of families to sustainably meet their basic needs and thrive in the broader community. Communities of color have long had to adapt to a housing system and a type of architecture that was not designed for them. And our project proposal prioritizes their way of living and adapted single-family housing infrastructure to not only meet the needs, but also to promote stability and resilience among communities of color.
So after we went through this creative process, we gave ourselves a survey like you do. And the members of this independent out of office team reflected upon what the barriers were to us being able to be more collaborative. And from this, we decided to return to our office with an intentionality about reinventing how we collaborated with a goal to promote teams being able to work in parallel, allow for creativity and emergent thinking to happen as a group norm, and for a model which would remove the silos of our professional disciplines and instead promote groups working together and around initiatives and task areas.
In our continued commitment towards anti-racism within our organization, we've adopted a sociocracy model as practice for internal collaboration for a few of our projects. Sociocracy invites us to make decisions in a more inclusive and deeply collective way. Decentralizing how we make decisions in our office meant unlearning hierarchy in the workplace that is typically defined by power dynamics and seniority. And we've been testing this team structure within our NELA LA housing work. As an example, our housing policy network. The project area, which focuses on increasing community involvement in housing policy, is organized into 3 sub-teams with rotating leadership roles. So the 3 main concepts of sociocracy are decision-making is made with consensus and it's driven by our mission and values. The teams are organized into circles that have specific domains or areas of focus, and team members can step in or out of roles as their capacity allows. And feedback is key to sustaining and adapting the work as it evolves.
Beyond connecting residents to local housing programs, we hope to increase community involvement in planning and housing initiatives throughout the region. With the support from Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, and CCF, the Call for Collaboration program, LA Moss will promote community-driven, equitable growth strategies through education outreach and resident-led advocacy. We'll also next be engaging residents in a series of workshops around the housing element update in the city of Los Angeles, as well as training and building a team of resident housing advocates to shape ongoing housing policy.
So across all of LA Moss's programs, we are striving to be community-oriented, inclusive, and anti-racist. This requires us to step backroom position as housing experts and instead follow the leadership of those at highest risk of being displaced and those who have historically been excluded from and harmed by planning practices. And we look forward to all that come and hope that you can join us as we connect with neighbors to reimagine what housing by and for community looks like in Northeast LA. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Chaz. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Christopher Hawthorne. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be able to be in conversation with Elizabeth and Chaz. And I want to thank them for the invitation to be with them and with you. And I want to thank Anne and everybody at the League for the opportunity to be here. This is really an office and a group of people who I think I and many of my colleagues go to with questions about how our own city processes work. Just to give you, all of you from outside of Los Angeles, a sense, they really do bring deep knowledge and thoughtfulness about how city processes might be better and how, as you just heard, how they're affecting communities where they're working. And so we really do go to them with questions about how we can do our work better. And we've been lucky to be able to work with them on some of the ADU projects that they talked about early in the presentation. And I particularly appreciate the willingness to be not just really ruthless in analyzing your own approach, but really honest about the missteps that you have made along the way and where you might do things differently. I think that kind of honesty is really refreshing and all too rare in this kind of presentation of work, which is sometimes just a kind of greatest hits slideshow. So really nice that you're going against that grain that I think everyone here is familiar with. And I think the work is particularly timely given the challenges that we face around housing in Los Angeles, many of which you already articulated. But again, for folks who are joining from outside of Los Angeles, not only do we face a housing affordability and homelessness crisis, COVID and the pandemic really clarified the particularities of these challenges. And what we saw was that neighborhoods that were particularly hard hit by COVID-19 were overcrowded, multi-generational neighborhoods where at least one member of the household had a job that could not be done remotely. And so at least one or more members of a household were going out to work and being exposed, and often bringing COVID-19 back to a household. And so the distinction between overcrowding and density in housing is something that is increasingly important for us to dig into and to understand. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about all of those issues and more over the next half an hour or so, and then we will open up the conversation to questions from all of you. So just to reiterate what Anne said at the beginning of the program, feel free to add questions to the chat as they occur to you while we're talking. And there will also be an opportunity once we open it up to Q&A at perhaps 10 minutes after the hour or so for you to unmute yourselves, turn your cameras on, and ask questions directly if you prefer to do it that way. So I'm really curious about this pivot that you made, that you talked about. I'm impressed by it. I'm intrigued by it. I have questions about it. But before we get to that, I wondered if we might just back up a little bit and you could talk about the founding of LA Moss and sort of where the office came from and how it was organized at the beginning and how it's evolved over the years before this pivot, which we'll talk about, I think, in some detail.
The founding of LA Moss, and Chaz, I'll take this one because I think you were in school at some point. I don't know where you were at in 2013. Actually, don't tell me you were in high school because that'll be deeply depressing. I had come back to Los Angeles after working in Rwanda and Liberia. And I was seeing that planners like Rudy Espinoza and who else? There was a number of people, or Claire Fox, were having conversations about the future of the city, and we were really seeing the beginnings of the affordability crisis. And parallel to that, the mayor was doing things around the People Street programs, which there were toolkits, which had permits on public space that were revocable if people didn't use them. And it also had these issues of not allowing street vending at the time. So it seemed as though the way we were talking about public space, on one hand, we were working with one hand tied behind our back. Yet there was this really groundswelling of people like Rudy, who was advocating for the street vending campaign. And with a deep sensibility around really linking the health of our communities to health of our public space and the policies that were preventing those two things being able to thrive. So LA Moss came from this sensibility at the time of really wanting to have a place, an architectural organization that could start partnering with the city and communities to bridge that gap between people who wanted to do projects that were potentially outside of the norm for the city family, but well within the practiced habits and life of communities of color. And so that was the early beginnings of things, but we've evolved a lot since then.
And did you see yourself as a design and architecture organization, or something bigger, something more at the beginning? How did that sort of self-definition evolve in the early years?
In the early years, we were told often what we weren't, which was an architecture firm. When we won the Emerging Voices in 2018, I think it was, Anne, I had heard from numerous jury members that it was a very heated conversation because we were not considered, what we were doing was not considered architecture. And I grew up as a third generation architect thinking, well, architecture is everything. And I think that if anything, I have had a lot of bias around my thoughts around the value of architecture that I've had to challenge in this new shift, and the value to it as a professional model. And I think many of us are struggling with that right now, and feeling really challenged by the future of architecture as a profession, because it's so much like the planning profession. If you really love what you're doing, I think I was always very aware that I had to betray architecture to be able to kind of actually investigate and include its true depth and ability,
Hmm.
if that
And
answers your
Chaz, it does. And Chaz, how did you decide, what attracted you about LA Moss? Why did you decide it was a place you wanted to go to work?
Yeah, I found out about LA Moss in grad school, 2017. um, and I was really taken by the kind of vibrance of the work around community centering. And I saw it deeply as architecture, as design, as something that was very inclusive. So I applied as a fellow back then, and have been with LA Moss for 4 years, kind of evolving through the different steps of hierarchy as one does. And in grad school, I didn't have any architectural experience from a firm. I was seeking to work at architecture firms, but I wasn't getting in. Like I kept getting rejected for maybe various reasons. But within my undergrad and graduate degree, I sought to do construction administration, not administration. I worked in construction as a laborer, as a project engineer. I did fabrication work. I refurbished pianos. I did things that kind of were adjacent to architecture that I really enjoyed because I wasn't getting into that space. And so when I went to apply for LA Moss, I felt like I didn't have enough qualifications to be there, but they happened to need somebody who knew how to build or install and was also very passionate about design and kind of community engagement. So it was a very serendipitous overlap. And I'm glad that they still wanted me to be there. And I'm very happy to be on this team as it evolves. And yeah.
The Love Fest. Elizabeth, you mentioned Rudy Espinosa and others who have been really important voices in doing this work in Los Angeles. I'm curious what models you were looking to early on, both in Los Angeles and elsewhere, that really did this combination of work. I mean, I think it did. I'm so glad that you mentioned this notion of having to betray the profession. I mean, there were certain models about what we used to kind of silo as humanitarian design or activist design for a while, and I'm glad that those labels no longer have to be applied. So I'm just curious what kinds of models you were looking to or finding or not finding as you were beginning to develop the work.
I had come from Mass Design Group. And at the time, I was the third or fourth hire. I graduated from the GSD with the founding group. And it felt deeply uncomfortable to be in that space of moving from Los Angeles to Boston to Rwanda or Liberia. And it felt like we really wanted to build capacity. We really wanted to do something different there, but the NGO, the nonprofit complex abroad in Africa, and as having kind of white identity, it was really hard to come from a place of authenticity. And so I think that returning to Los Angeles, which, as I mentioned, was my place and in a place that I felt deeply embraced and supported by. It was looking at community-based organizations like LTSC, Little Tokyo Service Center, looking at the arc of ELAC, East Los Angeles Community Corporation, looking at Trust South LA and the way that they were talking about different organizing models or community land trusts. I think it was very hard to look at other, and we struggled with this because as a nonprofit, you have to do different vision plans. And we struggled to look at other organizations in this design and architecture space in the US that were being community-based organizations while also centering the kind of design processes.
And so let's talk about this pivot a little bit more. You mentioned that it really accelerated, this turn really accelerated during the pandemic, but I recall talking with you and others from LA Moss about the potential of going this direction even before the pandemic. I'm curious sort of when, why, how the conversations began to make this what has emerged as in some ways a really profound and fundamental shift in what you're doing and how you think about doing it. And that's a question for both of you.
Yeah, I don't know, Chaz, when do you think we started talking about it? Because I think it's hard for me to pin it down because Helen and I had felt disassociated from the wins of the work, so to speak.
And that's Helen Learn, we should say, co-founder with you.
Yes, thank you. And we had felt disassociated from the way that LA Moss was building in the previous model. So I think, Chaz, it would be helpful maybe for you to answer this in terms of when this became something that was like an open office conversation. Columbus?
Right around that time. I think one of the major kind of shifts came when we were evaluating the Backyard Homes project. We were kind of really getting into it, going and running the program. And it came to a time when we had to evaluate our logic model and see what impact were we having, who were we working with, and if we were achieving the goals that we had set out. And I think it was confusing for our staff to kind of parse out what the impact was or what the goals were because there were so many. And I think that was an interesting point because when we hold that up against our mission, there was kind of a misalignment that was happening. So that was kind of the all in office, like, wait, this program is doing something, but what is it doing? So that was one of the turning points. I think also after Columbus, when we had participated in the exhibition.
Exhibit Columbus, right?
Exhibit Columbus, yeah. It was Helen Elizabeth who brought to the table that there needed to be some shift. Couldn't exactly name it, but it needed to happen, which is as a leader who or people in positions of power to be like, I don't know, and can you help, to folks just open it up to everybody is really powerful for us to figure it out together. So I appreciated that.
And once you decide to make this pivot and really focus deeply on place and community in Northeast LA, which is, part of the city that you all know extremely well and have, some of you have very deep roots. How do you decide exactly what the footprint will be? How tight or wide is that circle? And did you contemplate, a bigger area and narrow it down, or did you do the opposite? How did you think about that?
Place is, we're a place-based organization working in Los Angeles, right? So working in Northeast LA was a reaction to us looking at how, and the co-executive director and my partner, Helen Learn, is from Frogtown, raised in Frogtown or Elysian Valley, which is one of the 5 central communities in Northeast LA. I'm from a border upper middle class community of Los Feliz. So we were watching as Northeast LA was gentrifying. And we were also noticing that there was not a community-based organization or a CDC, a Community Development Corporation, that was in this space and in this territory of really looking at and offering alternatives to some of the symptoms and now like extreme problems and crises that are happening. And Northeast LA is a huge group of working class communities of color that was one of the epicenters of COVID, to your point. And it's one of these sites that's very central to Los Angeles, where there's a large amount of single family housing stock, but very complicated land use because it's situated in the middle of one of the areas of the LA River, which is going to be invested in hypothetically by the Army Corps of Engineers. So there's all of these complex things and overlapping conditions, cultural and land use wise, that led us to establish ourselves as a place-based organization in Northeast LA.
Chaz, do you have thoughts about that particular question, sort of how you, not just where and how you locate yourself, but where you draw the line of where your sort of sphere of influence ends and begins, I suppose?
I think it was hard to reconcile that after working across LA, that being intentional about being place-based within a community that we had been a part of, community members who reach out to us for assistance, for resources that we also ask for help and resources in exchange, that it doesn't make any other part of Los Angeles less important. I think that was hard for us to reconcile. And that being place-based or with community, and in some cases for folks who within our office are from Northeast LA, within community, kind of gives us all the ability to be very thoughtful about the programming in a place that doesn't really have those access to resources, in which Elizabeth was talking about community organization wise.
And let me ask a kind of devil's advocate question, which is, I mentioned that you as an office have become so sophisticated about how the city works, and I fear that we lose something if you're focusing in a place-based way in other parts of the city that may really benefit from that expertise. I'm curious about what you give up when you make this sort of a shift, and how you weighed that in the process of making it.
As a whole, we have been spread super thin. And I don't think that's surprising. And looking at the fact that we did, how many storefronts, Chaz, in 3 years or 4 or 5 years? We did 20, 30. And all of those business owners, the kind of marginal impact of that work when there were such systemic issues. And thinking about how hard we're working to get these 5 backyard homes built and how they're scattered across the LA city. Thinking about our public realm projects, which were temporary, and we had to go and deinstall sometimes after we got the permit. I don't know what we're gaining. Y'all might be losing something, but
I guess that's the point. It is something that we're losing, but something that other people.
Well, I mean, it's that car. It's the car selling thing, right? The theory of agglomeration, isn't it? There should be more of us. There should be more organizations like this, and then also there are community-based organizations like Trust or Sage that are doing this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so maybe the city can just have less processes. Mm-hmm. And not need people like us.
No, and I'm glad you mentioned those organizations and others that you mentioned earlier, because there is such a rich history, legacy, ongoing work by community-based organizations and activists around the city, often not necessarily touching directly on design or thinking of themselves through design, but in terms of all kinds of activism that is absolutely a strength of Los Angeles. And you mentioned as you were doing this analysis, something that a phrase that struck me was deciding what you would probably never do. So maybe it's the things you've already mentioned, but what else goes on the list of things you'd probably never do?
You said it, Chaz, so you have to answer it.
I think in that specific context, within how we were analyzing the metrics for what we won't do, it's kind of like in the quadrant of we're informing residents or we're ignoring them, overlapped with nobody's asking for this. So that is the will not do category in terms of like the context of our now place-based work. I think the type of work, if it's the question of like is there going to be more public realm work around furniture that supports folks' ability to have shade or access seating along a public right of way in Northeast LA? Or potentially also having us in the position of the design or architecture seat in designing or developing housing. I think those things are still emerging. And it's been important to us and uncomfortable to be in a space where we aren't proposing solutions as much as we are focusing on strategies to understand if things are or aren't needed, so that decision making is hard when we say it needs to be collective. Who's involved in that collective decision making? How do we get to that plateau where we're making those moves? Yes, we'll let you know when we decide to not do something else and why.
No, that's super helpful. I go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was just saying, I'm sure you'll hear about it.
That does lead to some questions I had about community engagement and how this pivot affects how you think about engagement, and whether it opens up new, perhaps more informal or ongoing conversations with the community, as opposed to what you described earlier as what is often the process with a capital P of community engagement that is highly formalized and often not very productive. So I have some questions about that. I have some questions about how to make it productive in the context of this housing debate in particular. But let's start just with the broader question of, do you see it changing and sort of melting into all the work that you do, given this pivot to more place-based work?
Chaz, I think you speak really eloquently about community engagement. I'm sorry. And the air of it and how that came out from doing that mapping around theory of change. And maybe I can get more granular, Chris, for you about engagement around things like citywide processes.
Sure.
But Chaz.
Yeah, I think as we were working out some of those diagrams, we kept saying community engagement, but we weren't in agreement about what that meant, because we knew that we need to do community engagement for our projects, but things that we weren't naming that were in the air of community engagement, which is like those formal and informal conversations that we're having with community members who are identifying what they need kind of in that process is, yeah, it's kind of like a very ongoing and emerging thing where, because we've been in the world of design and architecture, we're like, it's a step that we do. But because we're in community engagement work and folks are on the ground and are building relationships, it's much less kind of professional and like resident. It's more about like connections on a common baseline level. So our engagement associate, Lily Sanchez, she does a very like wonderful job at doing the resource sharing with other residents who are looking to like learn how to use computers or sign up for certain sort of services. And at the same time, folks are calling her at every sort of hour asking for different things, or offering also. So it's more, yeah, we try to define it, but it's happening.
It's like design. Like there's not a step, it's a system.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe I'm going to presume or assume that you're also getting at how do we engage the community on something that is an initiative happening outside of and not derived or brought from the community, some citywide policy like the housing element. And for us, really, this is an opportunity to mobilize our community. And we see conversations around that as a tool to get people to understand the current system so that they can push back and ask for it to reflect communities of color. So for us, community engagement, when it is kind of at a larger scale or citywide or the kind of housing conversation, place-based or citywide, and how we're navigating between both of those things. I think our vision is to put forward a city, our vision is to put forward a policy that reflects the world that exists but is ignored by planners, and aspirations for a world that could be better if everyone's included in shaping it. And so it's this kind of back and forth between mobilizing, organizing, kind of policy creation that we were already really wanting to do, but our organizational model prevented us from investing in.
Yes, that makes sense. And let me just say to the audience that we'll be opening it up to Q&A from all of you in a few minutes, and we'll just have a few more questions for Elizabeth and Chaz. So be thinking of your questions. You can share them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and turn your camera on once we get to that point in the program, which we will in a few minutes. But that leads to a question, sort of the million-dollar question in housing in Los Angeles, is that sometimes community input, not necessarily in this neighborhood, but let's say citywide, has been a force for maintaining a status quo that has been deeply inequitable, particularly in terms of opening up housing opportunities, equity, paths to homeownership, and housing stability to communities of color in particular. So I'm wondering how you think about that balance between the anti-displacement work you do, which is about the stability, the autonomy, self-determination of communities, which of course is so central to the work you're doing, versus opening up the new housing that we need, opening up opportunities for new neighbors, new residents to join the community, or for folks who have grown up in the community but can't afford to come back to rejoin the community. That's such a tricky balance, but it's really fundamental to almost every housing question that we're asking now in Los Angeles, how you strike that balance. So what kinds of things are you hearing from the folks you work with, and how are you thinking about that balance when it comes to new housing in the city?
Chaz, I'm all fired up to answer this, so.
Go for it.
Okay. Well, I think we know that, as you mentioned, the housing element can be informed by residents, by engaged residents. And I think that what we're really talking about, and there's this great Grace Lee Boggs quote around building community is to the collective as spiritual is to the individual. And so I'm laughing because I think I saw you do like a sigh, like, oh, more social justice.
No sigh.
But it's like we're really trying
it sounded
to.
like math. It sounded like it was going towards math. So that's what I was saying.
Oh, good. Okay,
Yeah.
well. So I think that when we're talking about someone who might not want an ADU on their hillside because it obstructs their view to trees, versus when we're talking about a two community members engaging with each other around what they want to fight for, being informed and joining in coalition to inform a system that doesn't support them, are very two different things. There is an existing system that supports the resident to say that they have eminent domain over everything they see, and that resident is a very, very small group of people. And that system is predicated on supporting those people to continue to have those resources, while the rest of the city does not have a land use that is defined by or supportive of them. And so it's just two different conversations. And I think that in many ways, we were reinforcing some of these systems around white guilt, which is very brutal to say, around some of our public projects, because we were giving the vision or the idea of something looking as if there's consensus building, but there's not going to be consensus building between those two polarized states. And so we're not trying for everyone to come along. We're really just trying to be able for these small wins, which are important, around issues that we're hearing from residents and other community-based organizations that we're in coalition with, that anti-displacement measures are essential, and most development is not for long-term residents. So like, it's not I don't think we expect to find too much, I think there's a lot of nuance in those buckets. And I think that really the coalition building community members around those topics is where we're going to have to do a lot of work, or like the kind of the project for the office for the next 6 months.
And speaking to Elizabeth's kind of point on coalition building, that is a very key component of it. There are housing groups who are doing so much work already, like Abundant Housing and LA Tenant Union, I think that's, yes, who have resident leaders, as well as folks who are kind of deeply embedded in policy. And as we kind of go through our work and figuring out how we might coalition build, meaning how can we mobilize with other groups and how might they be interested in mobilizing with us, where those common values lie around equitable housing as like the thing of why we're here. Like that is the non-negotiable. And that's why we're together, building those coalitions.
I'm feeling potentially sorry for all the architects that wanted us to talk about the first 5 years and we're just talking about coalition building. So happy to talk about that as an aside to anyone. My email is elizabeth@moss.la, and happy to talk about the pitfalls of those projects on a separate occasion.
And let me ask about the next 5 years, actually. And as I do this, let me invite the audience members to raise your hand using the raise hand feature, or just turn your cameras on and literally raise your hands so I can call on you if you have questions. I'm curious where you see the organization in 5 to 10 years, particularly in not just the kind of work you'll be doing. I'm curious about the mix. Who will you be hiring? What kinds of expertise are you interested in bringing in terms of adding to your own capacity? And what kinds of things would you like to be able to take on, given that sort of imagined growth that you're not able to now, or what you might be able to deepen that you're doing now?
We debated whether or not we were going to show a first pass of our organization restructuring, which we kind of came to somewhat of a consensus over in the last week. I think we're really talking about this soup that Chaz outlined. And Chaz, you do a better job explaining it than I do around community development. I'm not setting you up. But I think that we're talking about this economic development and housing development and models of ownership being central. And then the sociocracy model, there being these community outreach teams that we really need to build, but we're also really focusing on communications and storytelling, also policy and coalition building. And so we expect for those things to exist within the housing development bucket and the economic development bucket. And we do want to get crazy with NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. But we also know that it can take us 3 to 5 years, or look at how long it took Rudy Espinoza for the win around the street vending campaign. It's going to take a long time to affect policy. It's going to take a long time to do a development project that reflects our community. And so we know that there's going to be all this other economic development projects and housing development projects that we're going to be doing in the meanwhile, while we're doing these longer term coalition building work. And Chaz, what do you think? What are we going to be doing in 10 years?
Something along the lines of community economic development, housing advocacy, housing development. Hopefully, as we think about our organizational structure, and pretty much a consensus of something very non-hierarchical, something in which is fluid within the community, which allows for kind of a collective of folks to come in and out and have parts of programs in which they can contribute to, as something to look forward to. Something that, yeah, it's it's hard to come up with, to try to
It's hard to
figure
make
out that new
predictions.
direction.
Beyond Los Angeles, do you see yourselves as part of a network of organizations that are doing this work, and particularly for emerging offices that have similar aspirations? What kind of advice would you have for them about developing this work? So you're so focused in not just in LA, but in these neighborhoods in Los Angeles. But I'm curious about how you see yourself in a more national, international context.
As we were putting this together, it was very uncomfortable to put this presentation together for me personally, maybe not for you, Chaz, because you've been exercising this through DAP, but not orienting our projects in a kind of object-centered way. There was a conversation at SciArc that Chaz just linked me to, where it was kind of calling out a lecture around talking about what was it? All objects matter. And I think there's just such a difference between that architectural conversation and the one that we're having, or that DAP is having, that I think a lot of young groups are having. And so I would encourage those architects, those designers, those planners, anyone in these professional buckets to move with your values and kind of start building your community in multiple bubbles. As we've learned from the pandemic, that is really the best way to kind of maintain your resilience as an individual, but also kind of be a part of something larger. So I think LA Moss as an organization has been something in transition for the 8 years that it has existed. So every 2 or 3 years, we've kind of shifted and changed and moved with where the conversation in Los Angeles was going around these emerging issues that became crises. So I would just say being able to have that flexibility and interest and curiosity. I don't know. Chaz, I feel like I'm doing an awful job.
No, I like that. I like your answers a lot. Yes, being having a network, super important. I think that DAP was the first kind of, organizational group that I joined. And it's been really great to be in community with folks that have values that are aligned, but are also kind of lifting each other up in terms of like opportunities or like how we work together or talk to each other. And to Elizabeth's kind of comment around, LA Moss has been shifting over the past 8 years in terms of what we've been focusing on or doing. I kind of mentioned to Elizabeth maybe a few weeks ago that one of the first lectures that her and Helen Learning had done was this kind of plateau moment where they're like, it must be design plus, it must be design plus policy, design plus engagement, or it's not making an impact. And then like fast forward like 3 years later, we're like, it's not about design. So looking forward to another couple of years and how we continue to adapt.
It's not about the process.
And a question from the chat from Jennifer Davis. Thank you. She says, I was interested in how you explained the ADU development as existing in a conventional capitalistic model. What alternate development models are you interested in? For example, for developing the competition project you showed.
Well, there are lots of really great resources on the Low Rise competition website around, or discussions around new models for ownership, which we were very inspired by. Any of those listening sessions you want to shout out, Chaz, in particular, that you felt like were helpful to us?
Oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the names. Well, there was one where they specifically talked about what is it, co-housing or collective housing models. It might have been El Sereno Land Trust.
Community land trusts in particular, yeah.
Yeah, community land trusts. they were kind of exploring and explaining different ideas of real estate ownership through a collective model, which is really interesting. So in the realms of like traditional home ownership, someone is building equity because they can afford to kind of purchase that home. In the realities of the LA market, people who want to become homeowners who don't have that equity or that income, that can't reach that gap, aren't able to build to a point where they can afford a home. And they might not be setting their sights on that as much as, or maybe it's a balance of both, housing stability, with housing as a basic human right. So just having access to housing and decommodifying like what housing is to folks.
Thank you, Architecture League, for the link to the low-rise competition resources.
And yes, we did organize, we really tried to rethink, we don't even call it a design competition. We really tried to rethink how competitions operate and how they can sometimes be a vehicle for outside kind of architectural and other visions to be imposed on communities. And we really wanted to turn that upside down at the beginning of the process. So we began with a series of 5 listening sessions that that informed the brief and then became required viewing for all of the entrants in the design challenge. And then we invited several of the panelists and facilitators from those conversations to join the various juries for low rise. And I should say that we will be announcing the winners in that design challenge on May 17th. So keep your eyes peeled. We'll be adding them to the website at lowrise.la. Thank you for the chance to do a little promotion there at the end. So as we near the end of our time together, I'm just curious, both of you, and please in the audience, if you have questions, you want to unmute yourself, please go ahead and do that. We can take 1 or 2 more, I think. But I'm curious for the 2 of you, yeah, what didn't we touch on that you're interested in either expressing or talking about?
Well, I think that it's very interesting, and it's very, going through the first few years of architecture school, it's painful to learn how to think spatially. And it's a hard process to go through, but once you do, you can't really necessarily undo that learning. The same thing is true for seeing outside of an individual focused, capitalist oriented model of investing in or doing housing development. And so we, as an office, turned down a very large contract to build, I think it was 15 more ADUs that would actually have forgivable loans attached to them, which we mentioned was the kind of make or break thing for LMI homeowners, low to moderate income homeowners. And so that turning that down almost ended our office because we were in such an interior disagreement about that. And frankly, it was because of me and my personal bias around the value of those efforts, because I couldn't see around the fact that we were doing all this energy around these one-off development sites and investing in someone who already had relative amounts of privilege. I couldn't see how all of that effort could be better spent around building a coalition. And so I just think I want to outline how hard it is to see around the kind of cultural practices that we are engaged in and performing and consuming as people who even do have these values and care. And so, you know, the loving of the profession, it makes it really hard sometimes to make the right decision for where you're going to go as an organization that's place-based.
Mm-hmm. Chaz?
Nope. That's a great place to stop off. Thanks,
yeah,
Elizabeth.
I think that is a good, really nice place to end it, and I will hand it back over to Anne. But let me just first say thanks to Elizabeth and Chaz for that great conversation, for the great work, and the opportunity to talk a little bit about it with you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
unmute myself. I would just like to add my thanks to all three of you for this just truly thoughtful, in-depth conversation, both about, models of what architecture can do, but in, I think, a larger sense, which Elizabeth and I have spent a fair amount of time talking about, what architectural thinking can do to more broadly inform an approach to social activism. So we are thrilled to consider this the beginning of a conversation that we hope we will continue moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, and thanks everybody.